So if you've recently joined us, welcome. My name is Gareth, and you're part of a growing group either meeting live each Sunday on Zoom, or you're listening later via YouTube, where you'll find all the previous talks. I think there are probably about 25 or so there. You're joining us when we're currently studying a history of Christian missions. And for a few weeks, we've been looking at two great challenges the church faced. One was the barbarians, and the other were the Muslims. And we're covering a period at the moment between 400 and 800 AD. So this is part 9 of the series. And the church faced conflicts on these two fronts. The first was a temporal struggle with the barbarians. The other is a continuing challenge and an opportunity to this day, taking the gospel to the Muslims. And so what we're doing is we're looking at individuals who, with their strengths and their weaknesses, have made a unique contribution to the advance of world missions. And today we're going to meet a man who is considered by some, if you haven't heard his name, he's considered by some to be the greatest of all the missionaries of the Dark Ages. I'm referring to BONIFACE, apostle to Germany, who was born in 680 AD and died in 754 AD. So he lived to the age of what? 74 years, 754 AD. So he lived for 70 years, 74 years. Now, during the Middle Ages, development of Roman Catholic missions in Europe was accomplished by the work of one individual more than any other. His real name was Winfrith, or probably today we'd say Winfrid, although he was later known by the sobriquet Boniface, given him by Pope Gregory II. Now, that doesn't mean he had a good-looking visage. It means, Boniface, he who speaks of a good future. And he's been described as one of the most remarkable missionaries in the entire history of the expansion of Christianity. Yet, despite his sincere efforts as a missionary working under the Roman Catholic Church, his career partly reflected the lowering spiritual tones of the times. You see, the emphasis was on the Roman Catholic Church more than on Christ. The emphasis was on the sacrament more than on Scripture. So who was Boniface? By the way, it's spelled B-O-N-I-F-A-C-E. Well, given his name, it is surprising perhaps to learn that he was born in Crediton. Crediton is a town in Devon. Devon is a county in the southwest of England, not very far actually from where I'm talking to you from in Dorset. And he was born in the late 7th century. Against his father's wishes, he entered monastic life as a youth in the nearby town of Exeter. Exeter is what we call the county town or the leading city of Devon. And he was ordained a priest at the age of 30. Now, although there were many open doors for him to become a successful churchman in England, he was, for his time, unusually burdened for the non-Christian pagans on the continent. That means the European continent beyond the United Kingdom. We need to appreciate right at the start that his missionary efforts and those of many of his contemporaries were serious. They were planned, they were calculated, based on the conviction that the gospel must be preached to all those barbarous peoples who are still ignorant of it. Well, his first tour of duty was in what is today known as Holland, and it was amongst the Frisians. Now, the Frisians were an assortment of different tribes that lived mainly in North Holland and some in North Germany. Don't know if you've heard of the Frisians, but it might surprise you to know that today there are 500,000 Frisians speaking their own different dialects in the north of Holland. And those languages are recognised by the Dutch government. It's a sort of a farming area now. Anyway, Boniface was unsuccessful in his first little missionary enterprise due to political turmoil and also to much opposition. After the failure of this, which was really his first missionary enterprise, he returned home. And having accepted the position of head of a monastery, he was tempted to stay there. But the burden for foreign missions would not go away. So 3 years later, after his first failed venture, he went back to the European continent. However, this time he didn't travel to Holland, he went to Rome, where he realized he needed the backing and the recognition of the Pope, then Pope Gregory II, for what he was trying to do. As a result, he was consecrated by the Pope as a bishop to the German frontier, and he took the same oaths of allegiance and submission to the Pope as all the other bishops. This backing he considered essential, and it proved to be the endorsement that really coloured his entire career. I mean, we understand why, don't we? He was no longer an independent missionary trying to evangelize the pagan world without any support or any encouragement. Now, he was an emissary, if you like, a missionary sent from Rome itself by the Pope with a commission to establish the authority of the Pope over the church in Central Europe. He realized that there could only be permanence if the new churches were well and strictly organized, and if they could be sure of the direct support and help from the very top at Rome. Now, this might just seem a load of facts, but we need to realize that to a large extent, this was a new idea. The idea of papal backing to take the gospel beyond to unreached peoples. But it was actually one that would be replicated later in many places. So we see straight away that Boniface was something of a pioneer and a visionary. In fact, before that, in 723, he made a second journey to Rome, where he was consecrated as a missionary bishop just to the Germans generally. Now, new churches would get support and direct help from Rome. So Boniface, to begin with, sort of went to and fro somewhat, first going to Germany, then back to Holland for 3 years, before finally returning to Germany, where he served for the whole of the rest of his life. Now, since that earlier visit, some years previously, many so-called Christians had reverted to pagan practices, spirit worship, magic arts, and animism. So he decided on some drastic measures to counteract this sacrilege. And what I'm about to tell you is what Boniface is probably best known for. You see, he decided to strike a blow at the very heart of local pagan worship. So he gathered a large crowd at Geismar in Hesse in Germany, where the sacred oak of Thor, the thunder god, was located, and proceeded to boldly chop it down in front of the horrified crowd. Now, we need to understand this wasn't some Christian exhibition of violence or something that was done without taking into account the feelings of the local population. This act was in truth a conflict not between men, but between the gods. It was an example, I suppose, of power evangelism, where the greater powers would be revealed as the one to follow, so that you no longer needed to fear the lesser powers. And this is all part of a power-fear worldview. I'll say a little bit about that in a minute. In mission circles, it's called a power encounter. Anyway, chopping the tree down, legend says, and I quote, "The giant monster fell. Its trunk burst asunder into 4 parts, which, as they fell to the ground, miraculously shaped themselves into the arms of a cross, each arm of equal length." That, of course, was legendary, but the Germans were convinced that anyone who infringed the sacredness of the place would be struck down and destroyed by the gods. So, waited. They were expecting Boniface to drop dead shortly afterwards. And when nothing happened, they concluded that therefore there was no spiritual power in either the tree or the god whom they honoured. It also greatly increased the prestige and reputation of Boniface. And as if to press the point home to the people, Boniface proceeded to build a chapel there in honour to St. Peter with the wood of the tree. Writer Philip Schaff described it as a masterstroke of missionary policy, as thousands of people recognized the superiority of the Christian God and submitted to baptism. Encouraged, as well as probably relieved by the positive response, Boniface continued in the same vein, destroying pagan temples and demolishing shrines. You might say he developed a smashing ministry, even breaking, pulverizing sacred stones into small pieces. But why did he do this? Well, allow me a brief explanation. You will know as well as I that missions tells us that we should go and we should tell. But that's not the whole story. If you did go and you told the message, but it was in a language that the audience didn't understand, then that message would fall on deaf ears. It would fall broken to the ground. Missions is surely about going and telling a message that will be understood and that can be acted upon. However, it's not only language that can get in the way. Worldview can at times be a bigger obstacle. When I say worldview, I mean the lenses through which we see and interpret the messages around us. They're often particular to cultures. So if you share your worldview with a person from another worldview, if you're sharing the gospel from your worldview to a person from another worldview, would they be able to understand it? I think the first time this really struck me was when we were on the Doulos, one of the former OM ships in India. And I was tasked with presenting the gospel to large numbers of Hindus who would come on board, sit down for half an hour in the conference room and then go. I found very quickly that what I thought they were understanding, they were not understanding. If you say to a Hindu, you need to be born again, they would say, yes, I do. And again, and again, and again, because they believe in reincarnation. If you say to a Hindu, you need to have Christ in your life, they would say, yes, I'm happy to take Christ in my life, because they've already worshipping 300 million other gods. What you need to say is, no, Christ is the only God. You take him and forsake and abandon all the other so-called gods. So you see, it's important you understand the worldview into which you're bringing the gospel. Communicating the gospel effectively starts with an understanding. And there are three main worldviews. The first one, and this is the one I'm in the West, is basically guilt and innocence. So here in the West, the predominant view is that of guilt and innocence. Individuals, rights and values. You have rights to your own opinions, your own beliefs, and you can make your own individual path to your own happiness. So morality is based on right and wrong as defined by the law. So, as is often glibly said, you can do what you like as long as you don't hurt anybody. But if you break the law, you face the consequences. So most Western cultures are in some way in a constant search for the solution to guilt. But the word sin that we understand is meaningless in some cultures. I remember when we were in Sri Lanka, we were having an evangelist explain to us how you should seek to bring the gospel to Buddhists. For instance, it's no good talking about sin to Buddhists, not initially. If you say to a Buddhist, are you a sinner? They would say no. If you would say to a Buddhist in Sri Lanka, do you know a sinner? They would say, yes, I do. So if you said to that Buddhist, well, who's the sinner that you know? They would say it's the man who kills the pigs. Complete different understanding. If you travel to the Middle East and to Asia, where many of you who are listening to this are located, it operates differently. There, family and community are valued above everything else, together with personal relationships, social status, and reputation. If you come from a good family, you have a good standing in the community, and you follow the social norms, then you will have honor. Do something dishonorable, or have something dishonorable happen to you or your family, then you and your community will be shamed. So these cultures are not dominated by guilt and innocence. They're dominated by honor and shame. And these cultures will do everything to avoid shame. Perhaps at its most extreme, we find it in places like Japan. In Japan, if a man loses money in gambling, if he loses his job, if his marriage breaks down, do you know what his first resort is? Sadly, it's to seriously consider suicide. Japan has an extraordinary high percentage of people who commit suicide. Far more will commit suicide than will ever die from this pandemic. And indeed, far more have committed suicide than the many, many who lost their lives in the 2006 tsunami. I've even spoken to Christians who've contemplated suicide when something's gone wrong and shame has come upon their life. It's a big problem. But in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, the tribal peoples, such as where BONIFACE was operating, think differently. Their worldview isn't guilt, innocence, honor, shame. Their worldview is power and fear. You see, their decisions are based on their perceptions of the spiritual realm. What's the spiritual realm doing? More even than the physical realm. So as animists who see spirits dwelling in things and in places, what is most important is they keep the spirits as it were, around them, on side with them. And they need to know how to placate them when they're angry. So these cultures are very much dominated by taboos, by spells, by many superstitions. And the result of that is they often live in a constant state of fear. Hence the power fear worldview. And that is why Boniface did what he did. He understood how they viewed the world. Having said all that, by the way, if you want to know more about this, I can send you a little link to a very short and helpful video. Having said all that, Boniface, following a period of reflection, began to question his own rather aggressive approach to evangelism. He found another bishop and confided his doubts. And this other bishop suggested that such forceful methods were a little bit unwise and that he would do better to adopt a more meaningful and lasting approach. He suggested a method whereby you, and I'm quoting now this bishop's words, ask them questions about their gods, inquire about their origins, their seemingly human attributes, their relationship with the beginning of the world, and in doing so, elicit such contradictions and absurdities from their answers that they would become confused and ashamed. I mean, it's pretty obvious, isn't it, that felling sacred trees and smashing shrines might play a part in an initial evangelistic effort with people of this worldview, but that's totally insufficient foundation onto which to build a lasting church. So he took this bishop's advice and adopted a gentler and more reasoned way. Ironically, Boniface's response was to adopt some of the Celtic church's strategies. Now, bearing in mind what he thought about the Celtic church, that's quite ironic. So he chose several monks to work with him, who one by one would be assigned to a new area where they would establish a cloister and where training sessions could be started for new converts. He also recruited women enthusiastically to serve the cause of missions. And that was probably the first time that had happened in the history of Roman Catholic missions. Although, if you remember, Patrick had centuries earlier used women in the work of Celtic missions. Sadly, leadership of the Frankish church, the Church of the Franks, had become immoral and decadent and needed major reform. Boniface wrote a letter of complaint to the Pope, part of which says, "Religion is now trodden underfoot by them. All their crimes do not prevent them attaining to the priesthood. As they rise in rank, so they increase in sin. They become bishops, and even those who can boast that they are not adulterers or fornicators are nonetheless drunkards and soldiers who do not shrink from shedding Christian blood." Well, history shows that while a few things did eventually change, he was initially unsuccessful in carrying out all his intended reforms. However, in a series of councils that took place over 5 years, he was able to impose some discipline on the church and eliminate the worst of the abuses. Well, he made a third visit to Rome, and he was then himself given the power to establish bishops and was consecrated himself as the Archbishop of Mainz, which is in Germany. But what sort of church was he establishing? What were his distinctives? You see, he wanted to bolster the Roman Catholic faith He actually said he wanted to turn the hearts of the heathen Saxons to the Catholic faith and gather them among the children of Mother Church. See, in contrast to Celtic Christianity, the emphasis was more on the externals than on internal, personal, spiritual development and transformation. Had a passion, you might even say a fetish for uniformity, the right to eat certain meats, the date for Easter, making the sign of the cross at Mass. I mean, all things that, let's face it, we would consider minor, trivial issues. But he hated every feature of individuality. He wanted Ulster, I said, the Roman Catholic faith. To him, Christianity was identical with Romanism. And the fact that Celtic missionaries had wives and defended clerical marriage was an anathema to him. So it's not surprising, sadly, that the work of Boniface clashed with the missionary endeavours of the Celtic monks. As Schaff wrote, he reaped the fruits of their labours, yet destroyed their further usefulness. Sadly, Boniface denounced Celtic monks as false prophets. Now, another reason for the apparent success of Boniface in the face of frequent, fierce hostility and anger was the backing and help given him, not so much by the Pope, but by Charles Martel. Do you remember that name from an early lecture? Charles Martel was the Prince of the Franks and is remembered in world history for halting the advance of Islam in Europe. You'll recall perhaps the decisive victory he had at the battle that took place between Tours and Poitiers in France, where he stopped the Islamic advance in 732 AD. That proved to be a turning point in the advance of and the struggle against Islam. It was this guy who had Boniface's back. Boniface wrote, "Without the protection of the Prince of the Franks, I can neither rule the people or the church, nor defend the priests and clerks, monks and nuns, nor can I prevent the practice of pagan rites and the sacrilegious worship of idols without his mandate or the awe inspired by his name." So I think we have to say that in reality, Boniface was operating under the protection of Charles Martel. I remember when I was young, if I did something wrong, and my mother, who by the way is listening in here today, she would tell me off and I, would shrug it off. But if she would say to me, "You wait till your father gets home, I'll tell you what you did," I would, suddenly become very fearful. And it was this having Charles Martel in the background that helped very much in the advance that Boniface was looking for. Oh, by the way, it was the Franks who gave their name to the nation of France, although ironically they were actually a mainly Germanic tribe. Well, during the last years of his ministry, he wanted to get away from administration with its tiring and time-consuming demands. And so as a much older man, he returned to Holland in 553 AD and to the pagan Frisian northern area on the far side of the Zuider Zee to engage once again in pioneer missionary work. It seems, doesn't it? He never abandoned his hope that he might convert the Frisians. As Stephen Neal wrote, the spirit of the missionary prevailed and drove him out again into the lands where Christ had not been named. And you find sometimes missionaries who've somehow got caught up in administration as they get older, leaving that behind and re-entering at the grassroots level to that which they were originally called to do. On June the 5th, 1754, he and about, I think it was 52 other assistants and followers pitched their tents on the banks of the River Bourne near Dockham in preparation for a confirmation service of some new converts, because they had actually met with some success in their ministry. Sadly, that confirmation service never took place. Boniface and his companions were attacked. It is said that he declared to his assistants and followers, "Cease fighting, lay down your arms, for we're told in scripture not to render evil for evil, but to overcome evil by good." He feebly and unsuccessfully tried to defend himself with a Christian book, but he and all his companions were killed by a band of angry, armed pagan Frisians. Having killed Boniface and the entire company, the Frisian bandits ransacked their possessions, but found that the company's luggage didn't contain any of the riches they'd hoped for. One report says they broke open the chests containing the books and found to their dismay that they held manuscripts instead of gold vessels, pages of sacred texts instead of silver plates. Thus ended the ministry of medieval Europe's most energetic and outwardly successful missionary. His legacy is considerable. To this day, he's greatly revered by German Catholics. And as you travel around the UK, you'll find more than one church, one Anglican church called St. Boniface. And just last year, that's 2019, Devon County Council, with the support of the Anglican and Catholic churches in Exeter and Plymouth, officially recognised St. Boniface as the patron saint of Devon. So there you are. If you ever travel through there, look out for any reminders of St. Boniface. So finally, how come we know more about Boniface than any of the other missionaries of this period? Well, it's very simple. He was a copious writer of letters, and a number of his letters survive, as well as other materials that he wrote. So because of that, we're able to learn a good deal about his missionary methods from the correspondence he had, and we can better understand how he operated. According to some of his letters, what he did was, when a group, through the influence of the chieftain or the ruler, when all the rest of that tribe decided to become Christian, it was customary to baptize them without much delay. These mass baptisms were usually held on 2 annual dates in the church calendar, at Easter and at Whitsun, in other words, Pentecost. Then followed a long, difficult and patient process of trying to make those who become Christians by name, Christians by deed and behavior. I hope today we would say we're Christians by conviction, by conversion, and by commitment, not just by name. Because if you're a Christian by name, then you truly are a nominal Christian. So there we are, Boniface. I think our time may have gone unless they've given us some sort of restriction. They've taken off the restriction. Oh no, We have just over a minute left. So, Manu, would you be kind enough to unmute everybody so we can greet each other? Maybe they have to unmute themselves. Anyway, it's great to see you all today. Thank you for joining us. I know Christmas time is very busy.
Happy New Year to
Happy
everybody.
New Year
Merry
to you.
Christmas.
God bless you. Joe Gonzalez, God bless you, brother.
Happy New Year.
Sanjay and Bastine,
Happy New Year.
to you in India. Hope you had a good Christmas.
Yeah.
It must have been west here in England. We had one day, Christmas Day, when we could meet together, and now we're back under more serious lockdown. Bless you, Caroline. Nice to see you. Lovely to see you. Colin,
Yes,
Diane, good to see you as well. So many people around.
Yeah.
And I look forward to seeing you next week. Bring your friends, invite them to join if you think it would be good. Jolie, lovely to see you. God bless you.
Yes.
Nice to see you.
Bye. Thank you again.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Nice to see my
Bye-bye.
mother too. Hello, Mum.